My name is Alice Utley. I'm an associate solicitor here at TLT, and in this bite-sized session, I'm going to talk through the use of subcontractors under the Procurement Act 2023. I specialise in advising on public procurement law, as well as on complex commercial contracts within the public sector and on matters such as grant funding within the public sector space. This session will focus on the 5 topics listed here, namely, what are the rules around using subcontractors? When will you need to inform the contracting authority that you're using subcontractors? How should you select your supply chain and subcontractors? How should suppliers manage their subcontractors? And what are the consequences of not complying with these rules? So what are the rules around using subcontractors? Well, the rules sit in various different places within the Procurement Act, but the key points to note include the conditions of participation, which are under Section 22 of the Act. This part of the Act states that a contracting authority may set conditions of participation, which require you to demonstrate how you have the technical ability to perform the contract. In construction, it is highly likely that a supplier will only be able to meet or demonstrate the conditions of participation by reference to one or more subcontractors, depending on the value and complexity of the contract. As this is a may option, i.e. the contracting authority may set conditions of participation, and the requirement needs to be proportionate, contracting authorities will need to consider whether they need the details of all of the subcontractors who are to be used or relied on, or whether they just need to know the details of those subcontractors whose contracts have a contract value above a certain percentage, for example, 10% or more of the procurement's value, or above a certain threshold, for example, i.e. the contract would amount to a covered procurement in its own right. Suppliers will need to read this requirement carefully, as failing to provide all of the information which a contracting authority requires could amount to them being excluded from the procurement. Section 25 relates to subcontracting specifications. So a contracting authority may require a supplier to use one or more specific subcontractors, subject to the contracting authority being permitted to make a direct award under the Act to that subcontractor. And in construction, this would potentially amount to the contracting authority nominating a supplier. So other rules to note include Section 28, which relates to excluding suppliers by reference to subcontractors. Now, this is where the Act gets more specific than the current legislation. Specifically, just as the Act restricts who the contracting authority should contract with, it flows this restriction down to who the contracting authority subcontracts with. To facilitate this, the Act sets out what information a contracting authority must or may collect and how this information is to be used, potentially requiring a supplier to place an unsuitable contractor or run the risk that they may be excluded. This is a different assessment to the requirement for a supplier to detail how they will use their supply chain to demonstrate that they have the technical ability to deliver the contract. Depending on the design of the procurement, this information may be collected as part of the conditions of participation stage and/or as part of the tender requirements, and potentially as part of a design or mobilisation phase in a staged award. For example, a 2-stage design and build contract. It is therefore recommended that suppliers check their proposed supply chain against the exclusion grounds in Schedules 6 and 7 of the Procurement Act before including them in a tender or proposing them during a design phase. Section 72 relates to subcontracting directions. Now, this is another area where the Act gets more specific than the current legislation. Under the Procurement Act, where a supplier has indicated that they intend to subcontract and they are relying on that subcontractor to meet the conditions of participation, then you must enter into a legally binding arrangement with those subcontractors for the purpose of that subcontractor performing all or part of the contract, as required or indicated. So when will you need to inform the contracting authority that you are using subcontractors? Well, you'll need to inform the contracting authority that you're using subcontractors in all of the situations listed on the slide, specifically when submitting a selection questionnaire, when submitting a tender, including identifying changes since the selection questionnaire stage, when appointing a subcontractor who has not already been approved, either during a design phase or during the delivery of the works. However, it is unlikely that a supplier will have identified their whole supply chain at the point of tendering for a contract. And where a supplier is proposing to change a subcontractor, for example, during the life cycle of the contract. Suppliers will need to read the procurement documents carefully and make sure that they understand what information they will need to provide and when they will need to provide the information in relation to their proposed subcontractors. Suppliers should also create a supply chain register that will allow them to monitor subcontractor suitability throughout the procurement and contract, either using Constructionline or by reference to the central digital platform. As mentioned already, there is provision in Section 25 that allows a contracting authority to direct the supplier to use a specific subcontractor. Where this option is being utilised by the contracting authority, suppliers should check whether these will be nominated or domestic subcontractors, and where the latter, how performance risk will be managed. So how should you select your supply chain and subcontractors? In line with Procurement Policy Note 0324, which relates to supplier selection and exclusion, where a contracting authority is procuring a public works contract, they should use the Common Assessment Standards, or CAS, questionnaire to assess supplier suitability both during the procurement and before award. This replaces the previous PAS 91 questionnaire. Part of the reasoning behind the CAS is to standardise the questions being asked, and the purpose of the accreditation is that it allows suppliers to answer the questions just once and to have the confidence that they have been answered correctly ahead of the procurement process being commenced. It should be noted that the accreditation does not mean that the supplier is suitable, only that they have completed all of the questions. Where a supplier is using an extensive supply chain, it is proposed that the supplier uses the same or a reduced set of questions to vet their supply chain, whilst being mindful of the obligations to apply a proportionate process. To quickly run through the questionnaire, as per the slide, the CAS includes numerous sections, some of which can be directly linked back to the selection questionnaire in other situations. So, Section 1, Supplier Identity. This includes and builds on the questions asked in Part 1 of the selection questionnaire. Financial information. This relates to the information asked in Part 3, Section 4 of the selection questionnaire. Detail on your corporate and professional standing. This relates to the information currently required under Part 2 of the selection questionnaire, which covers questions on the mandatory and discretionary exclusion grounds. We expect that when the Procurement Act comes into force, the CAS will be updated accordingly to ensure that it is aligned with Schedules 6 and 7 of the Procurement Act with regards to mandatory and discretionary exclusion grounds. Health and safety, this being specific to the industry. Detail on your environmental arrangements, which includes both general and industry-specific questions. Quality, covering questions on quality relating to regulations, supply chain control, and risk management. Building safety. This section is new. It was added in version 4 of the CAS, which was published in July 24, and it includes questions relating to the arrangements and competencies in place to achieve Building Safety Act obligations. Fairness, inclusion, and respect contains questions on the Equality Act, including in relation to subcontractors. Fairness, inclusion, and respect, recruitment policies, and details of unlawful discrimination, compliance actions, or breaches in relation to relevant bodies or legislation. Information security and GDPR, covering questions on the same. And information management, again detailing questions relating to the same. The questions include a mix of mandatory and optional questions and encourages ISO accreditations, although alternative options of demonstrating equivalence are accepted. From a supplier perspective, obtaining accreditation via Constructionline will likely be the most effective option. However, contracting authorities may not mandate accreditation, and so could, as an alternative, build the questionnaire into their e-procurement system or provide a supplier with a Word version of the questionnaire to complete and submit in line with the procurement documents. Contracting authorities can also benefit from a Constructionline membership, as this would allow them to access the information submitted by suppliers and to set out which discretionary grounds would amount to an exclusion if they had not demonstrated appropriate cleansing, for example. It would also enable them to set out which of the optional questions are mandatory for them. In addition to using the CAS for public works contracts, contracting authorities may use a reduced version of the CAS for below threshold procurements, which have a value above the finer tender service threshold for goods and services, noting the requirement to be proportionate in the design of a procurement. Again, a membership with Constructionline can support contracting authorities with collating and assessing relevant information. So how should suppliers manage their subcontractors? Well, as previously mentioned, the Act includes several obligations where a supplier intends to use a subcontractor, and these obligations will continue throughout the procurement and for the life of the contract. The Act requires a supplier to enter into a legally binding arrangement with suppliers that have been nominated by the contracting authority or on whom the supplier is relying on to meet the technical requirements set out in the conditions of participation. However, it is advised that suppliers enter into legally binding agreements with all subcontractors, and that these contracts explicitly set out how the various obligations and implied terms will be met in a clear and concise manner to ensure that the supplier can meet their obligations to the contracting authority. The sort of topics that suppliers should address include the ability to terminate a contract where a supplier becomes excluded or excludable, to ensure no unnecessary payments become due, as these will not be reimbursable by the contracting authority. In addition, the contracting authority will require suppliers to support them with meeting the various performance and reporting obligations. And where these are to be delivered by subcontractors, these contracts need to explicitly detail the data or performance information needed. For example, where a subcontractor is responsible for meeting one of the KPIs, this could be reflected in their contract as an obligation, such that a failure to deliver against this requirement amounts to a breach. As such, failure could result in poor performance notice being published against the supplier, rather than the subcontractor. So what are the consequences of not complying with these rules? So as already discussed, if you fail to select your subcontractors carefully or monitor your subcontractors against the exclusion grounds and fail to take any necessary action accordingly, such as selecting another subcontractor, then you could face being excluded and prevented from progressing in the procurement process, or the contract may be terminated where it has already been entered into. Similarly, if you will be using subcontractors, either because the contracting authority requires that you subcontract, or because you've indicated your intention to the contracting authority that you will be subcontracting and you relied on this subcontractor to meet the conditions of participation, then you could be required by the contracting authority to enter into a legally binding agreement with the subcontractor. If you fail to do this, then the contracting authority may choose not to enter the contract with you, direct you to enter into another legally binding arrangement with another supplier, or if the contract has been entered into, terminate the contract, depending on the circumstances. And finally, failure to manage your supply chain and subcontractors could result in wasted and unrecoverable costs and/or poor performance notices being published due to a poorly performing supply chain. In summary, not complying with the rules could cause you to miss out on the current opportunity, lose a live contract, or even lose a future opportunity due to a discretionary exclusion being applied. So thank you for listening into our bite-sized session today. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me or any of the team who are shown on this slide. And finally, just to touch on our Procuring 360 initiative. It's TLT's support package for both contracting authorities and public sector suppliers in terms of getting ready for the new Procurement Act 2023. And through this, we're able to offer a wide range of support, not just legal, but also technical, consultancy, and more practical support too. So do check out our website or contact a member of the team if you require any further support in relation to getting ready for the implementation of the new Act. Thank you.